So from Aryans and Vandals and Catholics and barbarians, we're going into infectious diseases, environmental disasters, and plagues. And I'm really happy to introduce Philip Slavin, that got his bachelor's and master's degree at the Hebrew University and obtained his PhD from the Center for Medieval Studies at University of Toronto. And Slavin is a historian working on global history of infectious diseases, pandemics, and other big questions of history of evolution and ecology of plague on a global scale. And he's in a dialogue with other scientists coming from the other part of the hardcore sciences, DNA scientists. And so far, Philip has published 2 books and over 50 articles on various topics related to economic, environmental history, and history of diseases. So, Philip, thank you very much for coming, and we're looking forward to hearing you.
Okay, Boker Tov, good morning, Sabah al-Her, bonjour. I don't really have anything to add here except for 2 short apologies. So, first of all, I have to be very, very clear, I'm not an Africanist, so if I say something that doesn't really square up with reality, please don't be too harsh on me. And the second thing is that I have quite a few things to share with you, so my apologies in advance if I happen to run a little bit too fast. Right, how does this thing work? Okay, so I'll start with something very, very basic. So let me just say a few words what plague is. So it can be either highly or moderately infectious disease, which is caused by bacterium, particular bacteria called Yersinia pestis. It starts as a disease of sylvatic rodents, but at some point it crosses over to humans. It can spill over from to humans directly from rodents or via domesticates, camels or goats. It manifests itself as a human disease in 4 forms. Of course, we all heard about bubonic plague via fleas. You also have pneumonic plague, which is via inhaling aerosols. You have septicemic plague, which is the infection of bloodstream, and the least known form is gastroenteritis. It's an infection of contaminated food. So it's a very old disease, evolutionary. We're talking about something that is over 6,000 years old. It's very, very diverse in terms of its lineages and different strains. So if you look on the global distribution of plague in wild reservoirs today, you see that it's primarily confined to Central Asia, but also parts of Western America, South America, and now in Africa, which is relevant to our talk, it's confined to primarily East Africa, Madagascar. You don't really see it in Ethiopia anymore, although it did exist historically in Ethiopia. So if you look on the lineage here, you can see I'm not going to complicate things, you can see that there are lots of different lineages. What I will ask you to keep in mind for the rest of the talk is that there's one particular lineage which is relevant for our talk, and that's the lineage called one ant. One ant, that's the most important thing. So one of the most controversial questions in history of plague and historiography of plague is actually for both historians and for scientists is actually where and how exactly did it come to Africa. So the first team of scientists, microbiologists, led by Morelli in 2010, they sequenced 21 genomes from 20th century Eastern Africa, from the Great Lake region, and they all placed them on that branch that I was just talking about. 3 years later, there was another Chinese team led by Cui and his colleagues. They used a technique called molecular clock method, and they managed to approximate the emergence of that lineage that I'm talking about at some point between late 14th century and 17th century, so it's still very, very, very imprecise, right? George Sussman in 2015 published a very interesting article where he said, actually, wait a second, I mean, there's no way that there was plague in Africa at any point before the colonial period. And Monica Green, in 2 papers in 2014, 2018, she spoke about 2 introductions into Africa, one some point before the infamous Justinianic plague of the 6th century and the 17th century. The special issue of L'Afrique journal from 2018 had several papers talking about, there were several interesting hypotheses about plague in pre-colonial Africa. So Gallagher and Dupin used the evidence of abandonment of sites in Western Africa. Dera spoke about textual evidence of plague in Ethiopia from the 14th and the 15th century. Now, with all, I mean, they all have merits, but it's all just hypothesis. In other words, I mean, there's no way to prove that actually Africa did exist there. So there was one thing that I really want to bring your attention to is that I was really blessed, as Galia kindly mentioned. I've been, one of the most rewarding things about my academic career is to be able to collaborate with the people in sciences, and I was very lucky to collaborate with a team of scientists from Institut Pasteur in Paris, and what we did here, obviously not me, I was just playing the secondary fiddle. They sequenced 46 genomes from Eastern Africa from the 20th century associated with the same branch, and they managed to infer the phylogenetic history of the same branch. So actually that branch that I was talking about did emerge at some point in the 16th or 17th century, most likely in Africa. So, and in the course of the 19th century, that's the colonial period, and I won't be able to talk about that, but I have a paper which is ready to be submitted. There was a diversification of the strains of the same branch. And I was actually, my contribution here was I was responsible for the interpretation of the DNA data. So for the rest of the talk, I want to really briefly talk about how plague was introduced on 2 occasions into Sub-Saharan Africa. So first, of course, Ethiopia, and Dera in her article used evidence from Ethiopian sources, from chronicles and Synaxaria, hagiography, and there are references to, I'm sorry, I don't read guess, so actually one of my colleagues helped me with that, but the word for epidemic, generic word for epidemic is bed. There's mota-bed, which is roughly translated as epidemic death, or hamama-bed, which is translated as an epidemic suffering. So, for example, there is a reference to plague around 1370s, 1403. I'm sorry, I won't be able to go into the details, but I'm happy to share the details at some point in the early 15th century. I mean, the problem is that those sources that talk about bed that don't describe the symptoms, so we cannot be sure for 100% that we are talking about plague in fact. And to complicate things even further, that guy Niccolo de Conti, who visited Berbera in Somaliland around 1430s, that although he never visited Ethiopia himself, but he states that, oh, life is so great there, Ethiopians live much longer than Europeans, reaching some insane age, precisely because there is no pestilence. We don't know if it was correct, because, again, he never visited Ethiopia. He traveled to Berbera approximately 5 years before a major plague outbreak actually did break out in Berbera. And actually, the same outbreak I'm talking about was the watershed event in the global history of plague. So I would claim that the first verifiable case of plague in Ethiopia happened in 1433 in the monastery of Dabra Dema. It's in the Seraya region in southern Eritrea. And according to one local source, it was such a harsh event that the monastery was deserted for the next 175 years, and only to be visited by pilgrims and from nearby villages. Al-Makrizi, of course, comes to rescue, as he always does. And here's what he says. It's not from his suluk, it's from one of his epistles. And it says here that the plague, when he describes the plague that happened in Ethiopia, he says, and in Yemen, says that the plague started in Bilad al-Habasha, where it killed lots of people, including the Christian king, most likely Sarwe Yaisus, and the new king took over. And then it says that from there it spread into Berbera lands, then to Bilad al-Zanj, the Swahili coast, roughly speaking, then to the port of Aden, where it arrived in December 1435. So we also have the Yemenite connection. Now, importantly, when it comes to Rasulite sources from Rasulite Yemen, actually, they are giving us symptoms. They talk about swellings, buboes. So we can more or less be sure that, confident that it was maybe the first reference to bubonic plague outbreak in Ethiopia. So how did it get to Ethiopia? Most likely via Egypt. There was a major outbreak from December 1429. Then it's penetrated further south into Upper Egypt, so there's evidence of southward movement, and 2 years later it reemerged in Ethiopia. It was, according to Al-Makrizi, by the way, it was the second harshest outbreak since the Black Death. And according to him, there were something like 82,000 deaths in Cairo, most likely exaggeration, but let's not go into that. There's plenty of data about the commercial and the diplomatic links between the Mamluk Egypt and both Solomonic Ethiopia and the local Muslim Sultanate as well. Trade, as I said, either direct or indirect. You have Ethiopian Zanji slaves and eunuchs ending up in Cairo, gold and exotic ivory, mostly for exchange for pottery, jewels, spices, carpets, and so on and so forth. So did plague after that introduction fossilize in Ethiopia? Most likely there's a catalog of outplay of something which may be interpreted as plague outbreaks. There was at least one outbreak in 1530s that did mention symptoms as well. Again, quite a patchy information where exactly the reservoir may have been located, but maybe there are several references to the fact that each plague wave would start in the Gojam region, maybe near Lake Tana. It's high elevation, quite favorable conditions for plague outbreak. But after 1634, there were no more references. There were references to other diseases, like smallpox, but not to plague. There's no more reference to bed. And not even in the 20th century we have plague in Ethiopia. I mean, it was gone. Now, the second introduction, which is much more complicated and, for me at least, also more fascinating because it was so challenging to work on that. So the Great Lakes, the Kingdom of Buganda was one of the many polities around the other Great Lakes. It's important to keep in mind that up until the early 19th century, it was one of the most isolated regions in the world. It was largely terra incognita. I mean, people just didn't know about the existence of that place, and there's some archaeological evidence about short-distance trade. There's no trans-regional trade in that period. Yet you do have references to plague outbreaks in Kingdom of Buganda from about 1700, and as I will show in a second, it was definitely plague. Well, how do we know that, right? Well, we're very lucky that from the colonial period onwards, you have the process of codification of history of Buganda Kingdom and other kingdoms in the region as well, based on oral traditions. One particular person that was playing a very important role was a local intellectual called Apollo Kagwa, Kings of Buganda and Customs of Buganda, both translated into English. Anglican missionary John Roscoe is another very important contributor. Here is the king. So this is Lake Victoria, and this is the Kingdom of Buganda, populated by Baganda people. So here's what we know from the kings of Buganda. There was one king, Kabaka, called Kayemba, who was very roughly, again, there's no way to be more precise than that, because they allocate one kingship generation equated with 30 years. He had it's a really, really sad story, quite a creepy story, I have to say, so brace yourselves. He had a son who was called Kawumpuli, and he was born limbless. And the king was so terrified that he exiled both Kawumpuli and his mother. And during the reign of the same king, there was a harsh plague outbreak that happened in the Kingdom of Buganda. People were fleeing from their homes, and it was miraculously the same limbless prince, Kawumpuli, who stopped the epidemic. And after his death, Kawumpuli was declared as a local Lubale. It's a godlike spirit in the Baganda tradition of plague, and he became actually, so he was responsible for warding off the plague, but he also became, Kawumpuli also became the word in Luganda language, that's the language spoken by Baganda people in Buganda, for plague. His father built a temple in Buyego, it's in central Uganda, where his remains were kept. They were dedicated to priests that took care of local communities during the outbreaks by distributing metal amulets against plague, sending the subordinates to cleanse the houses and gardens of plague victims, and sheltering wives, children, and cattle of local household leaders. So this is the temple of Kawumpuli in that place. So there were And after that, actually, we do hear about subsequent outbreaks in Buganda. I mean, I cannot really go into the details. I can maybe just give you some really, really bizarre story. There was one Kabaka, one king called Semakokiro, who in the early 19th century, there was an outbreak, and he tried to use this outbreak in order to get rid of one of his political opponents by sending him deliberately to a house of one of the plague victims in order to make sure that he died. And guess what? Actually, he didn't die. And I mean, you have fossilization of plague and you have outbreaks up until today, but was Kawumpuli the plague, of course? I'm trying to be a devil's advocate here. And of course, kings of Buganda don't really provide clinical symptoms of Kawumpuli. Who does provide clinical symptoms of the disease called Kawumpuli are early missionaries and doctors, both British and French, who lived among the native people. So here's what they report. They report that the local, when they actually witnessed plague outbreak from 1877 onwards, they knew it was plague, and they tried to treat people. And they stated that the locals refer to plague as Kawumpuli. And the locals also state that this disease has been there since pretty much forever. They don't remember how long. Now, we also, if we can join this to the fact that from phylogenetic evidence, which I showed you in the beginning, the earliest ancestor of all one ant branches arose at some point in the 17th century. We already have quite a strong case for the fact that the introduction of plague did happen at such point. But how did it get introduced here? Do I still have 5 minutes to finish? Okay, so here we have the map in our forthcoming study about the outbreaks of plague around the Great Lakes. So there are several theories. So some scholars say that it came from the east via Oman in India, via the Swahili coast. Again, not only that there were no trade relations, but there's no outbreaks of anywhere on the Swahili coast until 1898. Monica Green suggested 4 hypotheses. Could be Swahili coast, could be North Africa, across Sahara into Chad Basin. No way. I mean, I went through all the local chronicles, like the Kano Chronicle, Bornu Chronicle, Diwan al-Khanem, Bornu Sultans, and so on and so forth. There was simply no plague anywhere in the Chad Basin, and in fact, you never had plague in that region. It just never got there. From Ethiopia, as we've seen, there was no plague after 1635, so it leaves us with one possible scenario, Egypt and Sudan via the Wild Nile. Let's see what happened. So in order to travel from the Delta up to Buganda, it requires traversing 4,500 kilometers through lots of conflicting polities, also through very, very difficult terrain of the Sud Swamp, right, of southern Sudan. Now, several people like Leo Africanus, Chelebi, and also Burkhardt, who visited this place, say that actually there were no plagues in what is now Sudan. So how did it reach there? Let's look here. Here we have annual Nile flooding levels from the 16th to the 20th century. Look at this year, 1693, right? It was very, very, very extremely dry year, right? The Nile flooding levels were extremely low. Unfortunately, there's no information for 94, 95. It just doesn't exist. So remember the Kawumpuli outbreak happened around 1700. What we have in Egypt around the same time, you have 2 back-to-back harvest failures caused by abnormally dry summers, great famine, very, very harsh. And there was one chronicle who says that there was no such harsh famine remembered since the early 1301 during the Ayyubid period. To make things even worse, because people were migrating from place to place, it also led to the spread of plague in 1695, 1696. What do we know about it now? We need to get to the south of Egypt now, right? So very lucky we have evidence south of Egypt. So there was a French ambassador and Dr. Charles-Jacques Poncet, who was ambassador to Ethiopian Emperor Iyyasu I. He lived in Cairo and witnessed the outbreak in the city. After that, he traveled to Ethiopia via Funch, via the Sultanate of Funch. And on his way there, while he was crossing to along the Nile, he said that he saw a multitude of depopulated village in Funch, and he specified that it was because of the same plague which he witnessed in Cairo. And he also comments on the multitude of skeletons and camels that he saw in the desert who died because of very dry conditions. Muhammad al-Nur bin Daif Allah in his Kitab al-Tabaqat fi Khusus mentioned also drought in Funj in Sudan, but unfortunately skipped the events of the next year, so he just doesn't cover anything in those years. Okay, and now I'm entering into the realm of speculation. I have no better solution if I'm really asking you to help me if you have any better idea how it might have penetrated further south. So the only piece of information which is very circumstantial I could come is to connect the 1619 crisis to the migration of the Luo people. It's a local Nilotic ethnic group. So from Sudan, from southern Sudan into Nyanza province in Kenya via the Lake Victoria. So according to anthropologist J.C. Lawrence, who published this book in 1957 based on oral tradition, the Luo migration was actually caused by drought and famine. And I speculate that that drought may have actually helped them crossing the Sud swamp that became dry. When they arrived around Victoria Lake, Luo conflicted with the local people, the Iteso, Buganda, and Basoga natives, and they pushed the Iteso people from the Usoko district southwards into Bukedi, and actually the westernmost frontiers of Bukedi are quite close to the location of Kavumpuli temple. It's a hypothetical scenario, but I couldn't have come up with something else. I really ask for your help. Okay, just to conclude, so if we can join both textual and ancient DNA phylogenetic analysis, we have the following picture. There were two introductions of plague into sub-Saharan Africa. It came to Ethiopia from either later 14th century or more likely maybe from 1430s from Egypt via trade and movement of people, but it also came to Buganda, and later on it spread elsewhere around the Great Lakes from the early 18th century onwards. In the context of drought, famine, and migration, plague did get focalized. It became endemic in both Ethiopia, temporarily at least, and in Buganda. I said that introduction to Buganda is really fascinating because the Great Lakes region was really isolated from the rest of the world until 1830s. The introduction of 1700 therefore happened under very, very extreme circumstances of a trans-regional or trans-Nilotic or pan-Nilotic crisis. And that's another example, it's another reminder that plague is often interconnected with the environmental disasters, and it's also a reminder that indeed Africa has to be studied in a much wider context of global history, and I hope that I did make this point. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you very much. It was really interesting. Questions? Oh, many. Okay, Yuval will start.
Thank you. This was really fascinating and completely something else. I wonder whether, because you focus on Africa naturally, but you worked on other regions as well.
Yes.
Can you maybe provide some kind of a comparison with this methodology that you are trying to do with, scarce evidence, historical evidence, with more natural scientific data, and to say whether this region that you investigate is exceptional in this, or other very isolated regions? You show us the big global map in the first one of the first slides.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, it's not per se the comparison in terms of how isolated the regions were, but I think the best comparison here would be with the story of the origins of the Black Death in Central Asia. Obviously, Central Asia was not isolated. It was a super interconnected region with the rest of the world, but there's a problem. Zero textual sources about how exactly the Black Death ended up spreading from from Tian Shan region into Crimea between 1338 and 1345. So in order to get a picture, very good, any idea how it could have spread, so we really have to use ancient DNA. We have to use archaeological evidence as well, and by conjoining those lines of evidence together, we can only appreciate actually how it happened there. In other words, there were quite a few examples where we have either very little or no evidence at all, and we really have to rely on other lines of evidence, on other sources. In terms of the isolation, I would say that in terms of different case studies of plague, and I'm really working on different parts of the world in as far as the second plague pandemic is concerned, Great Lakes region was slightly in its own league, I would say. It was really, really isolated, and in the beginning, I mean, I was really, really baffled how on earth it could have ended up there. So I was, trying all possible scenarios, and eventually I had to narrow it down. But I'm more or less satisfied with I'm not dissatisfied with my hypothesis because it does match our phylogenetic information. So I hope that partially answered the question.
Thank you. This is fascinating, really. I'm looking for the theological thread. In the story of Kawumpuri, is there any attempt to insinuate that there was crime and punishment, that the plague came as a result of the behavior of the kings or who exiled his son?
I was looking for that myself, actually, because not only that the global history of plague is interconnected region, but also culturally, obviously, we have to think about cultural explanations as well. To my surprise, there was nothing of this kind. My impression was that you just don't necessarily have the same connection between the cause and the effect at that point. In other words, there were no attempts to look for some theodicy, for some explanation why it actually happened. Not that I'm aware at any rate. I may have missed something, but I did actually read all these passages related to plague. I mean, obviously there are lots of criticism towards the behavior of different kabakas, different kings. Nothing as far as the connection with plague is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it ties into your talk on Friday.
Looking forward.
Yes. And thanks for the nice picture at the end, too.
Oh.
So you, at the very beginning, you mentioned the various hypotheses, and you said why they don't seem to hold water. Can you go back to that list?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you go back to Deira from 2018, textual evidence of plague in 14th, 15th century, approximately in Ethiopia. Now, and you say, so what was his textual evidence, and how is it different from what? Her. I'm sorry. What was the textual evidence from, and how is it different from what you brought?
Actually, so as far as Ethiopia is concerned, all 14th, 15th century evidence that I showed, actually, it comes from her, it derives from her article. I did use later sources as well, so there's no difference. I mean, I'm not Ethiopianist.
So she cited Makrizi here?
Sorry?
Did she cite Makrizi?
Among other people as well, but she was primarily confined to Gez sources, which I don't read, unfortunately. But she translated, and I mean, all the sources are either translated into Italian or into English, in Russian as well, so I was able to read them.
Hi, thank you very much. It was really fascinating, and I was just wondering if you were sometimes using some visual representations that could have, I don't know, indicate if there was a plague or not, like if, you know what I mean?
Yeah, again, I was thinking about this, nothing that I'm aware of. No, I mean, even I mean, the closest, again, I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert. I try to see if there are any iconographic representation from the Ethiopian context. No. The closest thing, actually, I know it sounds a little bit cynical of me to say, but the closest thing I found were photographs of missionary doctors from the late 19th century. That's the closest thing.
Thank you so much. It was so impressive. Thank you. I was just wondering, are you aware about what Ibn Khaldun, the famous thinker, said about the Black Death, as he used to call it? I mean, الموت الأسود. طاعون الجريف.
Yeah, طاعون الجريف. You're talking about is مقدمة, right?
Yeah, that's right. And also in the تعريف برحلتي غربا وشرقا, he used to say that the Black Death is the cornerstone of major change going right there, and there is no way for the Islamic world to recover from the plague. So, and obviously, Al-Maqrizi, his follower, in some extent, used to say exactly the same, that the Islamic world is struck again and again with the Black Death, Ta'un Jarif, Al-Mut al-Aswad, and there is no way to recover. So, what's your point?
I mean, first of all, it was absolutely right. I mean, both of them were absolutely right. It was a watershed period, not only for Islam, but for the whole world. I mean, I can give you, my favorite example, actually, what happened to Egypt. I mean, it's simply, and Stuart Borsch, a colleague of mine, actually did some good work on that. So, I mean, before the Black Death, Egypt used to be one of the two breadbaskets of the Mediterranean, right? After that, because so many people died and there were recurrent outbreaks, to make things even worse, actually I'm talking about this on Friday in a separate lecture in plague in Mamluk Egypt, because so many people died and because plague fossilized in Upper Egypt, and so there were recurrent outbreaks, so many people died that there were not enough working hands to keep irrigating the Nile. The crop yields actually went down, there was decay of all these canals, and crop yields went down, there were not enough harvest, and boom, it killed the Egypt is the main supplier of the international grain trade. And as far as Ibn Khaldun is concerned, by the way, there's one thing, I absolutely love him. There's one thing I'm a little bit pissed off with him. He ends his narrative in 1377, you see? And I'm desperately looking for a reference to outbreaks anywhere in the Maghreb in 1378 and 1379. Why? Because in 1379, plague comes to Al-Andalus, to Murcia. And I'm really interested, and after that, actually, do have reference in the Hafsid, Tunisia, but and it looks like plague also fossilizes in somewhere in the Maghreb. But I want to actually see when it starts. So I'm really unhappy that he finished his narrative in 1377. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Toda rabba.